Sarah Washington stood in front of her bedroom mirror, adjusting her pearl necklace one last time. At 42 years old, she had earned every bit of her success. Her dark skin glowed with confidence as she smoothed down her navy blue designer suit. The early morning sun peeked through her penthouse windows, reminding her it was time to leave for her important business flight. As one of the top investment banking executives at Morgan Stanley, Sarah had grown used to the finer things in life. But she never forgot her humble beginnings in a small apartment in Brooklyn, where her single mother had raised her while working two jobs. Those memories kept her grounded, even as she now lived in her luxury Manhattan apartment with a view of Central Park. The night before, Sarah had double-checked all her travel documents, just as her mother had taught her to always be extra prepared. She had a major client meeting in Los Angeles, and her company had booked a private jet from Newark Liberty International Airport, something she had done countless times over the past 15 years. Her driver, James, waited outside in the black Mercedes. He had been driving her for the past 5 years and always admired how she treated everyone with respect, from the building's janitor to the CEO of her company. "Good morning, Ms. Washington," he said with a warm smile, holding the car door open for her. "Good morning, James," Sarah replied, sliding into the back seat. "How's your daughter doing in college?" "She's loving it, Ms. Washington. That scholarship advice you gave her really made all the difference." During the drive to Newark, Sarah reviewed her presentation on her iPad. The deal she was working on would help create hundreds of jobs in underprivileged communities, the kind of work that made her proud of her career choice. She had spent weeks preparing for this meeting, knowing it could change many lives for the better. The traffic was light that morning, and James pulled up to the private aviation terminal right on schedule. Sarah gathered her Gucci briefcase and designer carry-on bag, both gifts she had bought herself after her last promotion. The terminal's glass doors reflected her image, a successful black woman who had broken through countless barriers in the predominantly white, male world of investment banking. Inside the terminal, other business travelers moved about with their usual rushed importance. Sarah noticed a few familiar faces, other executives she had met at various conferences and business meetings. Some nodded in recognition. She had earned their respect through years of brilliant financial strategies and successful deals. The terminal's marble floors echoed with her heels as she walked toward the security checkpoint. Her Rolex watch showed 7:45 a.m., plenty of time before her scheduled 8:30 a.m. departure. She had her documentation ready, her ID, company authorization letter, and flight details were neatly organized in a leather folder. Sarah felt good about the day ahead. She had woken up early to FaceTime with her teenage son, Marcus, who was away at boarding school in Massachusetts. He had wished her luck with the meeting and promised to ace his upcoming math test. Being a single mom and a high-powered executive wasn't easy, but Sarah had found her balance over the years. As she approached the security desk, Sarah noticed a new guard she hadn't seen before. He was a middle-aged white man with graying hair and a stern expression. Something about his demeanor made her slightly uneasy, but she brushed it off. After 15 years of flying private, she had dealt with all types of security personnel. Little did Sarah know that this ordinary Tuesday morning was about to turn into one of the most challenging and defining moments of her career. The next few minutes would not only test her dignity, but would also spark a chain of events that would lead to significant changes in the private aviation industry. With her usual professional smile, Sarah stepped forward to present her credentials to the security guard, Thomas Barrett, whose name badge gleamed under the terminal's bright lights. She had no way of knowing that this simple act would soon make headlines across the country and force many to confront the ongoing reality of racial discrimination in America's supposedly elite spaces. Thomas Barrett looked at Sarah's credentials with a frown that seemed permanently etched on his face. His eyes moved slowly from her documents to her face, then back to the papers, taking much longer than necessary. The air around the security desk grew tense as other travelers passed through quickly with just a glance at their papers. "There must be some mistake here," Barrett said loudly, his voice carrying across the terminal. Several heads turned to watch. "This is the private aviation terminal." He emphasized each word as if speaking to someone who didn't understand English. Sarah maintained her professional composure, though she felt her heart rate quicken. She had faced subtle discrimination before, but something about Barrett's tone was different, more openly hostile. "Yes, I'm aware," she replied calmly. "I'm Sarah Washington from Morgan Stanley." The flight details are all there in the documentation. Barrett picked up her company authorization letter, holding it at arm's length as if it might be fake. "And you're claiming this is your flight?" he asked, his voice dripping with skepticism. By now, a small crowd had gathered, some pretending to check their phones while watching the scene unfold. "I'm not claiming anything," Sarah said firmly. "I'm stating a fact. I have a confirmed flight this morning. All my documentation is in order, just as it has been for the past 15 years I've been flying private." She kept her voice steady, remembering all the times her mother had told her to stay dignified in the face of ignorance. The security guard's face reddened. He began pulling out rule books and regulations that hadn't been shown to any other passengers. "We have to be very careful about security these days," he announced loudly. "Can't be too careful about who we let through." A young white executive who had just breezed through security with barely a glance at his papers stopped and turned around. He looked uncomfortable, clearly recognizing the discrimination playing out before him. Sarah checked her watch, 8:10 a.m. Her flight was scheduled for 8:30, and she still needed to get through security and board. "Mr. Barrett," she said, reading his name tag again, "I have an important client meeting in Los Angeles. My credentials are legitimate, and my flight is waiting. What specific issue are you having with my documentation?" Instead of answering her question, Barrett picked up his phone. "Let me call my supervisor," he said slowly. "This situation seems unusual." He emphasized the last word while looking directly at Sarah. Two other travelers, both white men in business suits who had witnessed the entire scene, stepped forward. "Excuse me," one of them said, "but I've seen Ms. Washington here several times before. She's a regular flyer." Barrett ignored them completely. "Please step aside, ma'am," he said to Sarah. "We need to verify some things." He gestured to the side as if she were blocking other passengers, even though she was the only one in line. Sarah took out her phone and began recording the situation. She also sent a quick text to her company's legal department. "Experiencing obvious discrimination at Newark Private Terminal. Need assistance." The terminal's own security cameras whirred above, capturing everything. A young woman behind the check-in counter looked deeply uncomfortable, clearly knowing this was wrong but unsure how to intervene against her superior. "Mr. Barrett," Sarah said, her voice clear and confident despite the humiliation she felt, "I'm going to ask you one more time, what specific issue do you have with my documentation? Everything is in order, and you know it." Barrett's face turned even redder. "Are you threatening me?" he asked loudly. "I'm just trying to do my job, and you're being confrontational." He reached for his radio, presumably to call for backup. Sarah stood her ground, her designer heels firmly planted on the marble floor. She thought about her son Marcus, about all the conversations they'd had about standing up to injustice. She thought about her mother, who had faced similar discrimination in her time. She thought about all the young black professionals who would come after her. The next few moments would prove crucial, not just for Sarah's flight to Los Angeles, but for exposing a deeper problem that lurked beneath the polished surface of corporate America's supposedly elite spaces. The private aviation terminal, usually a quiet place of privilege and luxury, had turned into an uncomfortable theater of discrimination. More people gathered around as Barrett spoke into his radio. "I need additional security at the main checkpoint. We have an uncooperative individual." His emphasis on those last words made his real meaning clear to everyone watching. Sarah's phone buzzed. It was 8:25 a.m. Her flight crew was calling to check on her whereabouts. She could see her pilot through the terminal windows, standing near the jet, checking his watch with concern. 5 minutes until her scheduled departure, and she was still stuck at security. Two more security guards arrived, their heavy footsteps echoing across the marble floor. They were both young men who looked uncomfortable when they saw the situation. One of them, Officer Johnson, recognized Sarah from her previous flights. "Ms. Washington," Officer Johnson said with surprise, "is there a problem here?" Before Sarah could answer, Barrett cut in. "This woman claims she has a private flight booked. I'm just doing my due diligence." He held up Sarah's perfectly valid documents as if they were suspicious items. "Claims?" Sarah repeated, her voice firm but controlled. "My company booked this flight a week ago. Every single document you're holding proves that. Officer Johnson here knows me. I've flown from this terminal dozens of times." More passengers had stopped to watch. Some had their phones out, recording the scene. A businesswoman in her 50s shook her head in disgust at Barrett's behavior. Two pilots from another flight stood nearby, whispering to each other and frowning at the situation. Sarah's Louis Vuitton carry-on bag sat untouched beside her. Her Rolex watch now showed 8:28 a.m. The important client meeting in Los Angeles seemed to be slipping away with each passing minute. "I'll need to see additional identification," Barrett demanded, ignoring Officer Johnson's recognition of Sarah, "and we'll have to search your bags thoroughly." "This is ridiculous," said one of the witnesses, a gray-haired executive who had been watching since the beginning. "I just went through security 5 minutes ago. You barely looked at my ID." Barrett's face grew redder. "Sir, please stay out of this. This is a security matter." Sarah took out her phone again, this time dialing a number. "Since you won't accept my valid credentials, I'm calling the aviation company's management right now." Her fingers trembled slightly, but her voice remained steady. The young woman at the check-in counter finally gathered her courage. "Mr. Barrett," she called out, "Ms. Washington's flight crew just called again. They're waiting for her." "Let them wait," Barrett snapped. "Security can't be rushed." Sarah felt a mix of emotions: anger, humiliation, determination. She thought about her son Marcus again. Just last week, they had discussed how to handle racism with dignity. Now here she was, living that lesson in front of dozens of strangers. A man in a pilot's uniform approached the scene. "Is everything okay here?" "Ms. Washington, your aircraft is ready for departure." Barrett turned to the pilot. "You know this woman?" "Of course," the pilot replied, looking confused. "She's flown with our company many times. She's one of our regular clients." By now, Sarah's phone was full of messages. Her client in Los Angeles was asking about her delay. Her company's legal department was responding to her text. Even her son had sensed something was wrong and sent a message. "Mom, is everything okay?" The terminal's security cameras continued recording as Barrett shuffled through her documents for the fourth time. The crowd of witnesses had grown larger, many of them recording videos on their phones. This very public humiliation was being documented from every angle. "Ms. Washington," Barrett said, his voice dripping with unearned authority, "I still need to verify some things. Please step aside and wait." Sarah stood tall, her designer suit crisp, her dignity intact despite Barrett's best efforts to strip it away. She looked him directly in the eye and said clearly, "No, Mr. Barrett. I will not step aside. What you're doing is wrong, and everyone here can see it." The terminal fell silent. What happened next would not only change Sarah's morning, but would send ripples through the entire private aviation industry. In the tense silence that followed Sarah's words, the clicking of a woman's heels echoed through the terminal. Patricia Chen, the regional director of aviation operations, walked briskly toward the security desk. Someone from the check-in counter had finally called her after witnessing Barrett's behavior. "What exactly is going on here?" Patricia asked, her sharp eyes taking in the scene. The crowd of onlookers with their phones out, Sarah standing dignified in her navy suit, and Barrett still clutching her documents with a red face. "Ma'am," Barrett began, but Patricia cut him off with a raised hand. "I can see exactly what's going on," she said firmly. She turned to Sarah. "Ms. Washington, I apologize for this unacceptable situation. Please, let me escort you to your aircraft personally." Barrett's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. "But the security protocols." "I've reviewed the security footage from the last 30 minutes, Patricia interrupted. "I saw how you processed other passengers compared to Ms. Washington. That's all I needed to see." The crowd of witnesses began to murmur. Some nodded in approval at Patricia's intervention. Officer Johnson, one of the younger security guards, stepped forward. "Ms. Chen, I'd like to formally report that I've seen Ms. Washington fly through this terminal many times without any issues." Sarah checked her phone, 8:40 a.m. Her flight was now officially delayed. Her client in Los Angeles had sent 3 more messages. She took a deep breath and made a decision. "Patricia," Sarah said calmly, "I appreciate your intervention, but this needs to be addressed properly." She turned to the witnesses. "Would any of you be willing to provide statements about what you've seen here?" Hands shot up immediately. The gray-haired executive who had spoken up earlier stepped forward first. "Name's Richard Bennett, CEO of TechCore Solutions. I witnessed everything. This was blatant discrimination, and I'll gladly testify to that. A young woman in a business suit joined him. Amanda Torres, from Goldman Sachs. I've been recording since he started questioning your documents. You have my contact information and video evidence if you need it. More people stepped forward: pilots, other executives, even the young check-in counter employee who had finally called Patricia. Each one offered their contact information and support. Sarah's phone buzzed again. This time it was her company's legal department. Stay where you are. Our team is on the way. Document everything. Patricia turned to Barrett, who was still standing behind his security desk, though his arrogant demeanor had deflated considerably. Mr. Barrett, please surrender your security badge and exit the building. You're suspended pending investigation. You can't do this, Barrett protested weakly. I was just following procedures. The procedures are the same for everyone, Patricia replied firmly. The security cameras show you processed 12 other passengers this morning. Only Ms. Washington was subjected to this level of scrutiny. We both know why. As Barrett reluctantly unpinned his badge, Sarah's phone rang. It was her client in Los Angeles. She answered, explaining the situation professionally. To her surprise, the client was supportive. Ms. Washington, the client said, take all the time you need to handle this properly. What happened to you is unacceptable. We can reschedule our meeting. Some things are more important. Two men in suits entered the terminal, lawyers from Morgan Stanley's legal department. They had dropped everything to respond to Sarah's text. Behind them came a representative from the aviation company's corporate office. Patricia turned to Sarah again. We can have another aircraft ready in 30 minutes if you'd like to proceed with your travel plans. Or we can help you reschedule, whatever you prefer. Sarah looked around at the scene, the supportive witnesses, the lawyers ready to take action, Patricia's firm handling of Barrett, and the young check-in counter employee who had finally spoken up. This moment was bigger than her delayed flight. I'll reschedule the flight, Sarah decided. Right now, we need to make sure this never happens to anyone else in this terminal again. The wheels of justice were already turning, and Thomas Barrett's actions were about to have consequences he never expected. 1 week after the incident, Sarah sat in a large conference room at the aviation company's headquarters. The wall-mounted screen showed security footage from multiple angles of her confrontation with Barrett. The room was filled with serious faces, company executives, legal teams, and human resources representatives. Maria Rodriguez, the head investigator, pressed pause on a particularly telling moment of the footage. At this point, she explained, Mr. Barrett had already let 6 other passengers through with minimal checking. Then Ms. Washington approaches. The video clearly showed Barrett's immediate change in demeanor. The investigation had uncovered disturbing patterns. Barrett's employment history revealed a trail of similar incidents that have been quietly swept under the rug at his previous jobs. 3 other black executives had filed complaints about him in the past month alone, but they had been marked as minor incidents and filed away. We've interviewed 37 witnesses, Maria continued, shuffling through her papers. Every single one confirms Ms. Washington's account. The check-in counter staff have also provided statements about Barrett's pattern of behavior. Sarah listened carefully, her lawyer beside her taking detailed notes. The young check-in counter employee, Jessica, had provided a written statement describing how Barrett regularly subjected minority passengers to extra scrutiny. She had been afraid to report it earlier for fear of losing her job. There's more, Maria said, clicking to a new slide. We've reviewed 3 months of security footage. The data shows Barrett stopped and questioned 72% of minority passengers, but only 3% of white passengers. The aviation company's CEO, Michael Thompson, shook his head in disgust. This should have been caught earlier. We failed in our oversight. Sarah spoke up for the first time in the meeting. The issue isn't just Barrett, she said firmly. The system allowed him to continue this behavior. How many people suffered in silence before I had the resources and position to fight back? The room fell quiet. Sarah's words hit home. She pulled out a folder containing dozens of emails she'd received since the incident. These are messages from other executives of color sharing similar experiences, not just here, but at private terminals across the country. This is a systemic problem. The head of human resources, David Chen, cleared his throat. We've terminated Barrett's employment, but Ms. Washington is right. We need systemic changes. The investigation had also revealed troubling gaps in the company's training and oversight. Security staff received minimal training about racial bias. Complaint procedures were complicated and often discouraged reporting. I have a proposal, Sarah said, opening her laptop. Over the past week, she had worked with her team to develop a comprehensive reform plan. This isn't about punishing one person. It's about preventing this from happening again. The room's attention focused on her presentation. Her proposal included mandatory bias training, clear reporting procedures, regular audits of security interactions, and a diverse oversight committee. Meanwhile, across town, Barrett was facing his own consequences. The investigation had attracted media attention, and other victims of his discrimination had come forward. His previous employers were now conducting their own investigations, uncovering years of similar behavior. The footage from Ms. Washington's incident has been requested by the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, Maria reported. They're looking into patterns of discrimination in private aviation security. Sarah thought about her son Marcus. The day after the incident, he had told her how proud he was that she stood up not just for herself, but for others who might face the same discrimination. The meeting continued for hours. Every piece of evidence was examined, every witness statement reviewed. The company's lawyers presented their findings about potential legal liabilities. HR discussed necessary policy changes. By the end of the day, Sarah's reform proposal had been approved. The company committed to immediate changes, including installing new security cameras with audio recording, creating an anonymous reporting system, hiring diversity consultants to overhaul training, establishing a passenger advocacy office, regular audits of security interactions. As Sarah packed up her materials, Michael Thompson approached her. Ms. Washington, would you consider joining our newly formed Passenger Rights Advisory Board? We need voices like yours to prevent future incidents. Sarah looked at the security footage still frozen on the screen, a moment that had started as humiliation but was transforming into positive change. Yes, she said. This is how we make sure the next generation doesn't face what we faced. The investigation was ending, but the real work of systemic change was just beginning. 2 months after the incident, Sarah's legal team gathered in the prestigious law offices of Johnson & Williams in downtown Manhattan. The large conference room on the 45th floor offered a stunning view of the city, but no one was looking at the scenery. All eyes were focused on the evidence spread across the polished mahogany table. Lead attorney Rachel Martinez laid out their case. We have everything we need, she said, pointing to the organized stacks of documents. Security footage, witness statements, Barrett's employment history, and statistical evidence of discrimination. This is one of the strongest cases I've seen in my 20 years of civil rights law. The lawsuit named both Barrett and the aviation security company as defendants. The evidence was overwhelming. Videos from 47 different witnesses, security footage from multiple angles, written statements from 89 people, data showing Barrett's discriminatory pattern, testimonies from other victims, expert analysis of security protocols. Sarah sat quietly, wearing a burgundy suit that day, listening as her team discussed the legal strategy. She had decided to make this fight public, turning down several private settlement offers. This wasn't about money. It was about changing the system. They've offered another settlement, Rachel announced, sliding a document across the table. $2 million, but with a confidentiality agreement. They don't want this going to court. Sarah didn't even look at the paper. No, she said firmly. The public needs to know this is happening. How many others have been silenced by confidentiality agreements? The legal team nodded in agreement. They had already filed the lawsuit in federal court, and the media was paying attention. Major news networks had picked up the story. #JusticeForSarah was trending on social media, with thousands sharing their own experiences of discrimination in elite spaces. Barrett had hired his own lawyer, claiming he was just following security protocols. But the evidence showed otherwise. His work emails, obtained during discovery, revealed racist comments about passengers. Former colleagues came forward with stories of his discriminatory behavior. Look at this, said James Wilson, another attorney on the team, holding up a document. We found 17 complaints against Barrett from the past year alone, all buried by his previous employers. The door opened, and a junior lawyer rushed in with breaking news. 3 more aviation security companies are facing similar lawsuits, she announced. Sarah's case has encouraged others to come forward. Sarah thought about the changes already happening. The aviation company had implemented her reform proposals. Other companies were reviewing their security procedures. The incident had sparked a national conversation about discrimination in private aviation. The Department of Justice called again, Rachel said. They want to file a friend of the court brief supporting our case. They see this as an opportunity to address systemic discrimination in private transportation. Sarah's phone buzzed. It was Marcus. Mom, my school wants you to speak at our Civil Rights Assembly, his text read. She smiled, remembering how this case had affected him. He was learning that standing up for justice could create real change. The legal team continued planning their strategy. They would argue that Barrett's actions weren't just individual bias, they represented a larger pattern of discrimination that companies had ignored for too long. The first court hearing is next week, Rachel reminded everyone. The media will be there. Barrett's lawyer is trying to get the case dismissed, but with our evidence, that's unlikely. Sarah stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city below. She remembered how alone she had felt that morning at the terminal. Now, her case was helping others find their voice. There's something else, James added. Other executives are organizing a fund to help minorities fight similar cases. They want you to be on the board. The legal battle was bigger than Sarah now. It had become a movement for change in private aviation, challenging the invisible barriers that still existed in supposedly elite spaces. As the meeting ended, Rachel asked Sarah one final time about the settlement offer. Sarah shook her head. Some things are more important than money, she said. This is about dignity, about justice, about making sure my son's generation doesn't have to fight these same battles. The legal team packed up their documents, ready for the court battle ahead. They knew this case could set an important precedent for civil rights in private aviation. The fight was just beginning, but change was already in the air. 4 months after the incident, the executive boardroom of Elite Aviation Security was filled with tension. The company's top leaders sat around a massive oak table, facing the harsh reality of their failures. CEO Robert Matthews looked tired. He hadn't slept well since Sarah's case had made national headlines. Our stock has dropped 30% since this began, the financial director reported, pointing to a graph on the screen. Major clients are threatening to cancel their contracts. We need to do more than just damage control. The company's initial response, firing Barrett and offering a settlement, hadn't been enough. Sarah's lawsuit had exposed deeper problems. Now, they faced not just legal consequences, but a public relations crisis that threatened their entire business. Jessica Chen, the newly appointed Chief Diversity Officer, stood up to present. I've reviewed our records going back 5 years, she said. We've had 142 discrimination complaints. Most were ignored or quietly settled. This wasn't just about one guard. It was about our entire system. The room grew quiet. On the wall-mounted TV, a news channel was showing footage of protests outside their headquarters. Signs read, "End Aviation Discrimination" and "Justice for Sarah Washington." We've lost the Morton account, the sales director added. They said they can't risk being associated with a company that allows discrimination. That's $50 million in annual revenue gone. Robert Matthews finally spoke. We need to take full responsibility. No more hiding behind legal settlements or PR statements. What's the right thing to do here? Sarah's legal team had presented them with a comprehensive list of demands. A complete overhaul of security training. Independent audits of all security procedures. A $100 million fund for minority business travelers. Public transparency about discrimination complaints. Diverse representation at all management levels. Regular civil rights compliance reviews. The company's lawyers had initially advised against accepting these demands. It's too expensive, they had said. But now, facing public outrage and financial losses, the cost of not changing seemed higher. There's something else, Jessica added. Former employees are coming forward. They say they tried to report discrimination before but were silenced or fired. The media has these stories. The head of human resources shifted uncomfortably. We need to acknowledge our past failures, she said. Several board members ignored warnings about Barrett and others like him. We prioritized avoiding lawsuits over protecting passengers. Robert stood up and walked to the window. Below, another group of protesters had gathered. Among them, he spotted several of his own employees. The company's younger staff had been vocal about demanding change. "I just got off the phone with our biggest investor," the financial director said. "They're giving us 1 month to show real change, or they'll pull their funding." The board spent hours discussing their options. By evening, they had made several major decisions. Accepted all of Sarah's demands without negotiation. Committed $150 million to diversity initiatives. Created an independent oversight committee. Launched a full investigation of past complaints. Started a partnership with civil rights organizations. Required all executives to undergo extensive bias training. Sarah received their response the next morning. Her lawyer read the company's letter aloud. "We acknowledge our complete failure to prevent discrimination. We accept full responsibility and commit to fundamental change." The company's public statement went further. Robert Matthews appeared on national television, saying, "We were wrong. We failed our passengers, our employees, and our society. But admitting failure isn't enough. We must create real change." The stock market responded positively to the company's transparency. Other aviation companies started announcing their own reform plans, afraid of facing similar scrutiny. Inside elite aviation securities offices, changes began immediately. Photos of the all-white board of directors came down. Job applications poured in from diverse candidates. Security guards received new training. Employees felt safer reporting problems. Sarah watched these developments from her office at Morgan Stanley. Her son Marcus sent her a news clip about the changes. "You did this, Mom," he texted. "You made them change." But Sarah knew the work wasn't finished. The company's accountability was just the beginning. Real change would require ongoing effort and vigilance. Still, for the first time since that morning at the terminal, she felt hopeful. Sometimes, standing up for what's right could change not just one company, but an entire industry. 1 year after the incident at Newark Liberty International Airport, Sarah Washington stood at a podium in a packed conference hall. Behind her, a banner read, "First Annual Aviation Equality Summit." The audience included executives, security personnel, civil rights leaders, and most importantly, people who had faced similar discrimination. "A year ago, I was just trying to board a flight," Sarah began, her voice strong and clear. "Today, we're changing an entire industry." She wore the same navy blue suit from that fateful morning, but now it represented victory rather than humiliation. The changes had exceeded everyone's expectations. Elite Aviation Security had completely transformed its operations. 20 other aviation companies had adopted similar reforms. Congress was considering new laws about private aviation discrimination. A national database tracked discrimination complaints. Minority business travel had increased by 40%. Security staff diversity had doubled across the industry. In the front row sat Marcus, now a high school senior, beaming with pride. Next to him was Patricia Chen, who had been promoted to National Director of Aviation Operations after standing up for Sarah that day. Even some of the witnesses from the incident were present, including Richard Bennett and Amanda Torres. "The $150 million fund we established has already helped hundreds of minority entrepreneurs access private aviation," Sarah continued. "But more importantly, we've created a system where such help shouldn't be necessary anymore." Thomas Barrett's story had taken a different turn. After losing all his appeals, he had eventually agreed to participate in bias education programs. Now, surprisingly, he worked with civil rights groups, sharing his story as a warning about the consequences of discrimination. The young check-in counter employee, Jessica, had been promoted to head of passenger relations. She helped design new reporting systems that made it easier for employees to speak up about discrimination without fear of retaliation. Sarah shared the latest statistics. Discrimination complaints had dropped by 85%. Customer satisfaction was at an all-time high. Employee morale had improved significantly. The industry's reputation had recovered. More minorities were entering aviation careers. Security checks were both fair and effective. After her speech, Sarah had a surprise announcement. Today, I'm launching the Washington Foundation for Aviation Equality, she declared. We're starting with a $50 million investment to ensure these changes last. The foundation would provide scholarships for minorities in aviation, fund civil rights training programs, support advocacy groups, monitor industry compliance, help victims of discrimination, promote diversity in private aviation. Marcus joined his mother on stage. He had decided to study aviation law after watching her fight. My mom taught me that one person can change the world, he told the audience, but it takes all of us to keep it changed. The summit included workshops, panel discussions, and networking events. Security guards learned about bias, executives shared best practices, victims told their stories. Everyone worked together for continued progress. Later that evening, Sarah returned to Newark Airport's private terminal. The changes were visible everywhere. Diverse security teams at every checkpoint. Clear posting of passenger rights. Easy-to-use complaint systems. Welcoming atmosphere for all travelers. Regular audits in progress. Training sessions for staff. The same security desk where Barrett had harassed her now had a plaque. Treating every passenger with dignity and respect. The young guard on duty, a black woman, greeted Sarah professionally and efficiently. As Sarah boarded her flight to Los Angeles, finally making that postponed business trip, she reflected on the year's journey. Her stand against discrimination had created waves of positive change across the aviation industry. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Changed the world yet today, Mom." She smiled, looking out the plane window at the sunset. Sometimes, fighting for what's right meant not just changing rules or policies, but changing hearts and minds. The pilot's voice came over the intercom. "Welcome aboard, Ms. Washington." As the plane took off, Sarah knew that somewhere, another person facing discrimination would find it easier to stand up, speak out, and create change. Her mother had always told her, "When you face darkness, don't just light a candle, build a lighthouse." Looking at all the changes of the past year, Sarah knew she had built something that would guide others toward justice for years to come. The end was really just the beginning of a new era in private aviation, one where dignity and respect weren't privileges, but rights for everyone.